It's nice to see so many people turning out for this. Some people I recognize from the last time I was in Toronto, or at least on the outskirts of Toronto. I'm also glad to see so many people from the city here, a city that I used to spend a lot of time in visiting when I was a grad student at the University of Buffalo on the other side of the border. But that has a rather long time ago, and the city has certainly changed. So, of course, has the situation that we're here to talk about in Eritrea. Over the past decade, tens of thousands of Eritreans have fled their country to seek sanctuary elsewhere, often at great personal risk. But for many, the odyssey just begins when they get across the border. They face new dangers and hardships there, ranging from recapture by Eritrean security forces, which prowl the border in Sudan, to forced arrest and deportation by countries unhappy with their presence. But even worse is the tragedy that has befallen those taken prisoner by human traffickers in the Sinai over the last 3 to 4 years, where they've been tortured unmercifully while families have been extorted for exorbitant ransoms, leaving many of the victims maimed for life if they live through it at all. In fact, this trafficking has become so lucrative that the traffickers have been increasingly reaching back into Sudan and sometimes even into Eritrea itself, paying bounties, in effect, for those who kidnap Eritreans and then transport them to the Sinai, where they can be ransomed. Yet, despite the dangers that the Eritreans face when they come out, the outflow still continues unabated. 22 years ago, the situation was almost completely reversed. Eritreans in exile and refugees in the surrounding area were going back into Eritrea to help rebuild the war-ravaged country after it gained its independence from Ethiopia. By the close of the war in 1991, much had changed in Eritrean society as well. Through the course of the liberation struggle, more than a third of the victorious Eritrean People's Liberation Front members were women, including several who emerged in leadership posts afterward in the government. Ethnic and religious identities, though not absent, were nowhere near as divisive as in other fragile African states. Land reform had been carried out in some areas, as had administrative reform and marriage reform. And services like education and public health had been extended to parts of Eritrea that had never had them before. The EPLF, at least in the social and economic sphere, had already begun to function as a shadow government before it assumed power. In 1993, 2 years after the end of the war, there was a UN-monitored referendum on Eritrea's political status in which 98% of eligible voters, according to the government, registered, and more than 99% of those voting chose sovereignty, after which Eritrea gained international recognition and became the world's newest independent state. At the same time, the victorious EPLF changed its name to the People's Front for Democracy and Justice. In Tigrinya and Arabic, of course, it comes out the same. It's the People's Front, and formed a new government. Ethiopia's new government, led by allies of the EPLF, not only endorsed the referendum and Eritrea's independence, but assumed the financial obligations of the previous regime, which left Eritrea debt-free as it was launched as a state. A policy of economic self-reliance, low levels of corruption and crime, and a remarkable degree of volunteerism augured a decidedly different development path from most post-colonial African states. Eritrea was certainly not without flaws, but it appeared to be off to a promising start. So what happened to derail this promise? Why are so many of its citizens taking flight today? And could this have been foreseen? A turning point in Eritrea certainly came in 2000 at the end of the third round of a 2-year border war with Ethiopia that had unmasked both long-standing tensions between the movements governing the two countries and the deeply entrenched authoritarian political culture of Eritrea's ruling circle. The setback triggered contentious public debate over Eritrea's leadership and the slow pace of demonstration, much of which took place in a newly invigorated independent private press, which had basically developed during the course of the border war with Ethiopia in the late 1990s. Tensions then came to a head, as we heard in the introduction, in 2001, almost exactly 12 years ago to the day, with a sweeping government crackdown that left the country a tightly controlled one-party state. Also one on a permanent war footing, with no independent press, no non-governmental organizations of any kind outside of government or party control, and a ban on unsanctioned religious groups. The regime also rounded up thousands of young people to serve under duress in an open-ended program of national service, which had been launched in 1995 with an 18-month term of service, but was now extended for 8 to 10 years or longer. It did all this under an undeclared state of emergency in which a previously ratified constitution guaranteeing such rights as freedom of the press was left unimplemented, national elections were indefinitely postponed, and all suspected acts or expressions of dissent or disloyalty were regarded as treason. Today, Eritrea competes with North Korea and Turkmenistan for last place on most global assessments of human rights, press freedom, and democratic governance. And it has become one of the largest per capita producers of asylum seekers in the world. In the months leading up to the crackdown, I was in Eritrea on 2-month rotations on a project that was funded by the World Bank, working with the Ministry of Information to do 2 things. One, to write a country handbook describing the achievements of the country, and 2, to do training with both public and private sector journalists. Throughout this period, of course, in the late part of 2000 and through the first half of 2001, the signs of the imminent turn to repression were readily apparent. The ruling PFDJ convened meetings in January of 2001, 9 months before the crackdown, for mid-level cadre that excluded many high-ranking officials who were the subject of the meetings. Rumors flew through the spring of an upcoming purge as debate over the country's direction and leadership really erupted in the private press, with finally the publication of an open letter to the regime, to the president of the country, Isaias Afwerki, by a group of top leaders of the liberation movement and the government who were known as the G15, the Group of 15, because only 15 eventually signed the document. And it was a bill of particulars documenting the various grievances that were surfacing within the movement itself, but had not been before aired. This was published initially on the internet and repeated in the private press. People were interviewed about it. It was debated. The newspapers that were published during that time would appear on the street at dawn, and they'd be gone by 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. It was a vibrant and exciting time in many respects for the exchange of ideas that was taking place. But as the spring wore on, the preparations for the purge intensified. In the summer, a student leader was arrested after giving a speech in which he criticized the regime. And in August of that year, there was another session of mid and upper level cadres of the ruling party in a place called Ambakala, where they laid the groundwork for the final arrest. So everyone pretty well knew what was coming. So I was there as somebody who had been visiting the movement and the country before it was a recognized state since 1976, watching this unfold and increasingly troubled by what I was seeing. But a key turning point for me came at a downtown hotel, the Ambaswara for Eritreans who were here, where I was sitting there in June at a time when there were preparations being made to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the victory in the liberation struggle. And a young Eritrean came up to me, not the first time this has happened, saying, I met you in 1977 in a refugee camp in Sudan. And at that time, he was a young boy who had escaped from Eritrea with his family. And they were on their way out through Sudan to Europe. He said they went to the Netherlands, and he was so inspired by the ability to know what was going on inside the country through listening to the BBC and reading the reports that were outside about this, some of which were mine, that he committed himself to becoming a journalist himself. I was very touched by all this. And then he turned around to me and he said, I know you know what's going on here now. We need you to say something. It hit me right in the gut, as you can imagine, because, of course, I was aware, and I was not yet standing up and saying it, knowing immediately what the consequences would be. A week later, I gave an interview to one of the local newspapers, Satit, one of the ones shut down in September. Immediately after that, I was called into the offices of the PFDJ and dressed down by high-level officials and told I was doing damage to the country and at risk of being asked to leave. After the September crackdown, during which 11 of the G15 were arrested, one recanted, and the others were out of the country at the time, along with more than a dozen editors and reporters, and as the press, independent press, was shut down altogether, I did an interview with an Eritrean website, Asmarino, after which I was given my marching orders. And in the beginning of 2002, told that I should pack up and go home. They didn't make a big public deal out of it because at that time I still had a good deal of political capital in the country, and I think they wanted to do this quietly and avoid a scene. I actually had a multiple entry visa for the year, and I went back to Eritrea several times through the following September. But when the visa ran out, that was it, and I've been PNG'd ever since. But I often think about what that young Eritrean said to me. You know what's going on here, and we need you to say something about it. Never has that been more true for Eritrea than today, as the tragedy within the country has grown and spread through the refugee outflow, whose suffering has reached horrifying depths through one of the most brutal and callous human trafficking schemes in recent memory. And I would say to everyone here tonight, it's time for all who know something to say something and to do something. This evening I'm going to talk more about the crisis, how it got to where it is, and how a younger generation of Eritreans committed to getting the truth out are working to bring about change. I'm going to do this through a series of slides, starting with my early visits to the war zone back in the 1970s, and wind up with some images of recent trips over the last 18 months that I've made to Ethiopia, Israel, Egypt, and Sudan. So let's see if we got this down.
I'm just going to turn the lights off.
Great. And I just run it with this?
Yep.
Great. Okay.
Just click.
So I am also crediting my wife, Debbie Hurd, with some of the photographs. She's been to Eritrea with me 3 times since independence in the 1990s. There may be some out there who aren't familiar with where it is, so I'm just going to put this up there so you can get a quick sense of where Eritrea is on the map. You see it along the southwestern shore of the Red Sea, a strategic location that's made it the target of outside interest for millennia, going all the way back to the Byzantine Empire. It's sometimes described as the bridge between Africa and the Middle East. And certainly the narrow southern entrance to the Red Sea makes it an extremely strategic area for many outside powers in the region and beyond. Let's see. There's your intrepid reporter in a younger life, headed across northeastern Sudan during the rainy season on a camel, headed into Eritrea. We had to cross the border at night because in the 1970s, Ethiopian aircraft were in the sky bombing pretty much anything that they saw moving. So we moved across part of Sudan by camel, got back in, captured Land Rover, and I was driven in under cover of darkness to the base area. Throughout the mountains, there were caves and underground shelters where the front was operating practically an underground city with small workshops where they made leather goods, did machine tool repair, made uniforms, eventually buying chemicals, assembled basic medicines, and so on. They had to do this to keep the facilities largely inside Eritrea so they weren't vulnerable to pressure from neighboring Sudan. This is actually an example of an underground cavern that had been dug out of the ground, covered over by logs, then boulders, dirt, and brush so that you couldn't see it from the air. They are repairing captured weapons, and at that time, much of what they fought with was captured from Ethiopia. Much of it in that first period, too, came from the United States. They were also operating non-military departments in areas under their control. There were 2 liberation fronts with area at that time, each of which had similar operations, schools, clinics, and agricultural extension, and other kinds of work. This is a barefoot doctors group that went around with backpacks teaching basic sanitation and hygiene as well as doing curative medicine, serving, again, basically an isolated population in remote areas where they weren't receiving any government services. This was also a very politicized liberation movement, and this is a military unit. The same thing happened in non-military units. They would sit down sometimes 3 times a week for political lessons. The book that they're reading from, called Isaiah's Little Orange Book, was produced there in the field. And one result was that when outsiders came in and traveled in the front asking questions about the movement and its goals, you got practically the same word-for-word answer, which was quite unsettling at times, but it reflected the unity perspective that had been drummed into the members of the front. There was, underlying this, a secret party, which nobody then was clear about outside. It was called the Eritrean People's Revolutionary Party. And it had been established in the early 70s and played a key role in the formation of the EPLF as a front throughout the early years, and went on to draft its programs, select the slate of officials who would be presented to open public congresses for election with the results already decided ahead of time, and basically ran the operations of the front on a day-to-day basis. It was announced finally in the early 1990s after Isaiah claimed then that it had been dismantled, a subject we could come back to if you want. But it reflected the highly politicized nature and also the clandestine mode of operation of the leadership, even within its own front. This was, as I mentioned earlier, a front that had a high participation of women, a socially conservative society. So this was quite unusual. The women and men were trained separately. You're looking at a training camp for women here. You can see they've cut their hair, which is a radical step, leaving their village life and entering the front. They were then integrated into the same units at the end of the training period, which could last up to 4 months. And there were no gender-based units after that. Throughout the 1970s, the fronts, both of them were getting stronger and stronger. The regime in Addis Ababa was getting weaker, especially after the overthrow of Emperor Haile Selassie. But still in the mid-70s, the U.S. was backing the military junta that had taken over with a self-proclaimed goal of turning Ethiopia into a socialist state. It was an intriguing anomaly. In 1976 and 77, the fronts captured many of the cities and towns, and it looked like the war was almost over. The turning point here came at the end of 1977 in a battle for the port city of Massawa, which I witnessed. I'm right behind a barrier and a foxhole on the other side of these salt pans during this charge. A charge that was turned back by Ethiopia for the first time, stopping the Eritrean advance, because they had a new army that had been equipped, trained, and advised by the Soviet Union. And in effect, a second war got started at that point. A war much more brutal and involving much more sophisticated armaments, and forcing initially the Eritreans to retreat from the cities and towns that they had previously captured, all but one, a little one called Nakfa in the north. This is a shot of the trenches that they put up around Nakfa. This photograph here was taken in the 1990s, so this is after the war, but you may get a sense here that what they did was they moved back into the mountains and used the mountains themselves to create a kind of fortress around their base area. They dug into the steeper mountains, built trenches that ran for hundreds of miles. These trenches, in turn, were covered by logs, boulders, dirt, and brush, so they couldn't be seen easily from the air. And they brought the war to a stalemate after a steady series of retreats back to this area. And it remained stalemated more or less in the same area for the next 5 to 6 years. Actually, more than that, until 1988. The trenches ran in all directions. They neutralized the heavy artillery and the tanks, the Ethiopian hardware, which of course couldn't get up these hills, and that gave the Eritreans an edge. Outside, when politicians and commentators saw the extent of the Soviet buildup, saw the size and sophistication of the Ethiopian forces up against the Eritreans, and also were, of course, not perhaps surprisingly anxious about the leftist character of the liberation movement, they sat back and stayed out of it with the expectation that this would result in a kind of mopping up operation, and then they could woo Ethiopia back into the western camp. So the Eritreans were more or less abandoned at this time on the assumption that this was a losing battle. I went back in 1979, and this is interviewing the current president, Isaias Afwerki. We were both younger then, in a bunker right behind the town of Nakfa, dug into the mountainside where they set up their command post. And I, at that time, had heard repeatedly that they were not defeated, that they had preserved much of their strength and had filtered back behind the lines into the rest of Eritrea to resume operations. So I said, let me go back there and see it. And as a journalist, document what I see and hear, because that's the only thing that's going to change minds. And after considerable discussion, I was permitted to do it. And in 1979, I walked up around Ethiopian positions, down to the seacoast for the Eritreans who were here through Sheb, up through Gelab, Filfil eventually, and then up to the plains outside of Asmara. Along the way, I encountered Eritrean positions throughout the rural areas where they had resumed guerrilla operations and also had maintained control of most of the territory outside of the cities and towns and the major roads. They were also running schools and, again, carrying out health care, a big part of their operation, and a way in which they continued to maintain a relationship with the general population, many of whom supported the independence struggle, not just to get a flag up or to get Ethiopia out, but because they had a hope that this would give them a freer and more secure life in the years to come. I won't go through the whole story of the war, which would keep us here all night, but by the end of the 80s, the Eritreans turned the tables, encircled the Ethiopians, and by 1991, were able to fight the decisive battle outside the capital, Asmara, and defeat the Ethiopians. Shortly after that, they assisted Ethiopian forces who marched on the capital of Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, and took over the country there. The two movements then negotiated a peace agreement between Eritrea and Ethiopia and set up the mechanisms for Eritrea to hold a referendum on its political status. Needless to say, the citizens of the encircled towns were happy. It was a newfound freedom simply to be able to walk around the streets at night without a curfew, to be able to go outside of the cities and towns to villages to find out whether relatives were alive or dead, and to move freely in the marketplace. In the evenings in the capital, people would walk up one side of the main street, cross the street, and walk back. It was just exciting to be outside and be able to freely move about. In '93, I'd mentioned before, there was a referendum in which people turned out in droves. They carried it out over 3 days. My wife was a monitor in the U.S. There were voting stations in Canada, the U.S., Europe, and Australia. And I was in Addis for a day and then up in Eritrea for the second day. By that time, almost everybody had already voted. It was that quick. And it was a decisive victory. So at that point, as I said in the beginning, there was enormous hope. People were engaged in rebuilding the country, building houses and shops that had been wrecked by the war, which was the case all over Eritrea, except in the capital, Asmara. They were building new roads and planting seedlings, terracing hillsides. There was a massive outpouring of energy and commitment to try to build Eritrea up and to launch it into the modern world after being held back by this occupation and war for so many decades. This is a village called Ambatkala, not too far from the capital, where people turned out to build a big dam to create a year-round supply of water. But it's typical of the efforts that people made in the civilian population, with a little bit of help from the government, but mostly their own efforts. Sadly, the honeymoon ended before the decade was over. There were initially security problems in the West, with problems from jihadists coming across the border from Sudan. But then there was a falling out with Ethiopia in 1998, ostensibly over unresolved border issues, but in fact underneath it there was a power struggle taking place between these two movements, and there were many issues, political and economic, that also accompanied the border issue. But it was the border that triggered it, and before you know it, the country was remilitarized and back in the trenches. This is actually the view looking out over toward the Ethiopian border, that river in the background there, after a battle in a place called Tzarona, where I was in early 1999. And it was, as a famous American once said, déjà vu all over again. They were back in the trenches, and this is what those other trenches would have looked like that I showed you before. The whole, practically, youth of Eritrea was mobilized to go out back to the border to defend the country. After 3 rounds of fighting, during and after 3 rounds of fighting, that left practically 100,000 people dead on both sides. But the discussion about it afterward became so heated that the government responded, as you've already heard, by closing the door on public debate and discussion in 2001. And then after 2002, when a border commission set up to adjudicate the boundary dispute rendered its verdict and Ethiopia declined to implement it, the country was fully remilitarized. National service was put into effect on an unlimited basis, and the idea of a democratic opening was indefinitely postponed. So I told you already that at this point I was ousted from the country. I landed back in the U.S. at that point, and what happens to journalists who are in a dilemma like that? I, of course, became a professor. But I began going back to the region 18 months ago to research firsthand, again, the plight of the refugees. And I want to just take you through that for a minute, or well, more than a minute, and then come back and see where we are today. This is a not very good scan of a UNHCR map of Ethiopia showing where the camps are. There are refugees coming into Ethiopia from throughout the region in practically all directions. But the Eritreans are, or at least were then, this is May, June of 2012, in 5 camps. 2 over there on the right near former French colony, now independent Djibouti. And those are largely Afar-speaking people from the lowlands and the coastal area of southeastern Eritrea. The people from the central highlands, the most densely populated part of Eritrea, in the center where the capital and most of the towns and cities are, were escaping in the southern border there in the middle of the country, and were housed in 3 camps up there in the little crook up there. I don't think you can read it, but there's one up very close to the Eritrean border called, what am I looking at here? Shemelba, and then Mayaini and Adi Harush a little bit further south. I went up to those camps in June of 2012 and stayed in several of them overnight for several nights to talk to the refugees inside, and I'll share with you a little bit of what I saw. Adi Harush at that time was the newest camp. There is a 4th one that's been set up since then, but this is what a new camp looks like. The UN distributes tents to people. The camp, incidentally, is administered by the Ethiopian Refugee Authority, which maintains an office outside the camp. People who come across the border often end up in small villages or small military units. They get passed to a military command and are then trucked to reception centers where they're processed by the Ethiopians and then taken to one of the camps. There's a system, of course, of taking them to the newest camp where they're given a space to set up their own tent. They're given the tent, utensils, and some basic supplies. Adi Harush looks like what you expect a refugee camp to look like in many respects. The tents, the mix, at least in some cases, of improvised shelters from grass and stick gathered in the surrounding area. This is an arid, very hot, dry area, one of the poorest in Ethiopia, in fact, in northwestern Tigray. But if you walk around, this is actually a part of Mayaini, the larger camp at this point, the second one to be established. But if you've seen any images of refugee camps in the past, you will notice that there's a difference here. Most refugee camps tend to be made up of women, children, elderly, and infirm, with young men often scattering elsewhere looking for work or being involved in the conflicts, but not in the camps themselves. Look what you see here, a lot of young people, men and women. This is a watering station here that's open twice a day. Water is limited. But these are mostly young people who are there because they are fleeing the national service. Some 45%, according to Ethiopian officials, of those coming in are between 18 and 23. Again, very unusual. And that, of course, has its own impact on Eritrean society and on the military from which they're fleeing. There are also children, of course. You see them throughout the camp, some born there, some coming across with their families. There were also hundreds of unaccompanied minors, and this is an example of girls who had come across, sometimes one by one, sometimes in twos or threes, sometimes in larger groups. They were housed by Ethiopians, the Ethiopian authorities, in dormitory-like situations to keep them together. The younger ones with a kind of house mother, the older ones taking care of one another. But the fear, of course, is that these girls and also boys would fall victim to trafficking if they weren't carefully monitored. So that was an issue. These girls are not pleased. They are in the reception center and they're being forced to wait before they can get to the camp until they get all the bio data on them and make sure that there are authorities in the camp who can keep track of them. But at a reception center at a place called Endabaguma, this is what it looks like for the most recent arrivals to come across the border. This is an anecdotal snapshot of it, really. But take a look at the age and demographic makeup here of those coming in. They tend to be urban, from urban backgrounds, mostly, as I said, young people coming out of the national service. So at this point, Ethiopia has somewhere in the area of 70 to 80,000 registered refugees. There are undoubtedly many more who have come in that haven't registered. Ethiopian authorities estimated to me that there are about 330,000 Eritreans living in Ethiopia, including people who had migrated to Ethiopia much earlier and stayed, and others who were not registered as refugees. But it's a significant external population for a country whose overall population is variously estimated at between 4 and 5 million. The Eritreans have been coming out of the country, according to the UN, at rates reaching 3,000 a month. And you can do the math. That is a lot of people leaving the country. Many, for many years, came out and went to Sudan. Of course, Ethiopia was the nominal arch enemy of Eritrea, so people stayed away. But in Sudan, the people, many Christian Highlanders who came across the border, found enormous difficulties navigating the society in Sudan, especially under the Islamist government in power there since the late 80s. The refugee camps were dead ends for them, and many sought to go further to reach a developed country outside. So they often paid smugglers to help them get out. This is a map of the main routes that was put together for an article in the Wall Street Journal not too long ago. Initially, in the early 2000s, the flow tended out toward Libya and Egypt and hence to Greece and Italy. In the Libya to Italy route got fairly well shut down in the mid-2000s after a pact between Gaddafi and Berlusconi. And the migration route shifted eastward at that point. I think initially it was Sudanese who made their way up to Israel, but Eritreans soon joined in. And by 2007, 2008, there was a fairly steady flow of Eritreans up in that direction. Somewhere in that period, 2008, 2009, there are various arguments over how it may have started, but the traffickers who were assisting people to move tumbled to the fact that if they held the Eritreans and demanded ransoms from their families, many of which included relatives in North America, Europe, and Australia, and had access to funds, that they could get a good deal more back for transporting them. And so they started holding them and ransoming them. As the numbers built up in Israel, another problem arose for the refugees, and that was that there developed an increasing backlash against the influx of Africans into Israel. This is Levinsky Park in the center of Tel Aviv, which is a center of Eritrean social life, surrounded by shops, also many of them run by Eritreans, and restaurants. You could walk around there and hear Tigrinya spoken as if you were in the capital, Asmara. I was there in January of this past year to see the situation there, talk to Eritreans who had come across. I also met with quite a number of Israelis who were disturbed at the direction that the country was taking toward the refugees coming in, and were operating services. This is a soup kitchen in Levinsky Park. There was a group of artists who had set up a library to service the refugee population. But the backlash rippling through Israeli society was being driven particularly by right-wing nationalists, getting more and more intense as elections in Israel neared. And there were demonstrations calling for the ouster of all the Africans and for them to be sent back that were in turn powering a drive within the political sphere that resulted in the passage of laws in 2011 and the implementation in 2012 to restrict access to Israel by setting up larger detention centers, putting up a bigger fence, and making it less and less hospitable for them to stay in the cities of Israel. This is a demonstration that was really about as ugly as it gets that was going on. It looks big. Actually, part of that is because there were a lot of journalists and security people there. But there have been some big ones, and there have been some really horrifying incidents of attacks on Eritreans in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and elsewhere, coming out of this kind of anti-immigrant backlash. I got down near the border to Saharanim, which is a big detention center. It's not very far from the Palestinian detention center over the hills in a different direction. But this is where facilities were expanded with the idea that Eritreans would be at some point rounded up and deported, either back to their home country if they could convince them to sign papers accepting it, or to a third party. And in fact, there was an announcement not many weeks ago that Uganda was to be that third party and was making a deal with Israel to accept the refugees in exchange for unspecified payments. This is the border fence that was built along there, enough to make border guards in the U.S. and Canada jealous, I'm sure. It stretches from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. If you look down the hill, you'll see on the other side a smaller fence. That's the old fence on the Egyptian side. But this is impenetrable. There are electronic sensors all along it. And the ability to get across without a soldier escorting you through a gate has been virtually shut down. I think there were some 30 there in the last part of that got through in the last part of 2012 before I was there, and I don't think more than that have come into Israel since then. So this migration route is pretty much gone. But the capture, torture, and abuse of Eritreans within the Sinai continues. I'm not going to linger on this. But in Israel, I met a young man, Philemon, for some of the Eritreans here who have read his story, who had been kidnapped in a camp in Sudan, taken by traffickers to the Sinai, held in a torture camp on the Sinai border and forced to make phone calls to relatives begging for money while they chained him up by his hands until his hands were virtually destroyed, and dripped molten plastic on his back. This is the regular procedure for the trafficking victims. And I'm actually not sure of the word to use here at this point, because they're trafficked in this, they're captured at this point. Nobody's migrating there. All the victims of torture and ransoming in the Sinai today are people who were kidnapped somewhere in eastern Sudan, some from refugee camps, some from outside, transported to the Sinai, sold and resold, so in effect as slaves, until they're finally ransomed by the people at the higher level. The ransom themselves are paid in major cities in Africa, in the Middle East, in Dubai, in Europe. There's an Israeli film crew that captured a payoff in Tel Aviv. But after seeing the effects of this in Israel, I went back over to the area in June to go to the Sinai. And I don't have a lot of photographs of this because it was a dangerous place to be in June, and even worse now. This is just a shot of where we had to stop to get fuel to make our way across northern Sinai, and it's kind of typical of the stories you've probably heard of the fuel shortages all across the country that partly drove people's dissatisfaction with the regime at the time. But it was this was a journey that forced us to travel across in the end of the day and wait until nightfall to get to El Arish in the northern Sinai, change cars, putting ours in a closed garage, getting picked up by a group from a Bedouin clan in the border area that was very distressed at what others in the community were doing in the trafficking, and were trying to help the kidnapped victims escape. So we went in under cover of darkness. We stayed at the house of a man named Sheikh Mohammed in a place called Sheikh Zubaid, which you may read about. It's where there's been heavy fighting south of the Rafah crossing, right close to the Israeli border. The day before I got there, the Sheikh and a kind of posse from his clan had marched into a torture compound with their AK-47s firing in the air, and basically took it over and freed 9 hostages who were there. I sat down with them on the floor in the living room after that and watched the events on an iPad, because they had taken an iPad in there and shot videos of it. I'm not going to rerun the iPad videos, but they captured the liberators basically going in, discovering 3 men who had held the 8 Eritreans and 1 Ethiopian captive. Some of them had been there up to 5 months. They were all chained together in leg irons and one long, heavy chain. I watched them in awe of what was going on, not sure who it was. I also watched the liberators basically take the former captors and whack them with sticks until they would tell the story of what had happened from beginning to end. And then they freed the trafficking victims who had their first meal together. That night we moved into a hidden compound where the freed victims were. It was guarded, as you can see, by an armed member of the community there. And inside we found the victims. That's for the Eritreans who were here, Dr. Alganesh on the left, with whom I had gone in, an Eritrean woman based in Milan who works with an NGO called Gandhi they've got projects all across Africa, but she has been instrumental in trying to help Eritreans who have been victimized by trafficking to get out. So one of the things that we did was to gather biodata about the people and to get information and photographs to take back to the UN to get them papers so that they could be registered as refugees and make it out of the Sinai. I had a chance to hear their stories. There were 4 women among them. The 2 older women, one of whom on the left gave her age as somewhere more than 60, she wasn't really sure what, said they had been sexually abused 3 days earlier. Not the young ones, which was interesting. All had been beaten. All had open wounds. There's one with burns from... They hold plastic bags like you get in the supermarket and hold a flame under them, which is primitive but effective. This is beating that was done with chains. You see how thin he is? He has been there for more than 5 months, barely fed. According to Israeli human rights groups who have been interviewing the survivors, their estimate is that 4,000 Eritreans have died over the last 4 years. These are 9 at least who will live. That's Sheikh Mohammed in the middle. We left after 2 days. Actually, we stayed another day, and there were 3 more who were released that they found in another compound. This is a fairly small, tightly knit community, so everybody knows everybody else. The thing that was particularly interesting about this is that this is also a divided community. There are some who are deeply invested in a criminal enterprise. There are others who are opposed to it, and there's a lot of organizing going on within the community around this. The whole community, however, is generally influenced by Salafist politics, and if the Egyptian government goes in with a heavy military hand, as it appears to be doing now, without regard for the differentiation within the community, they will have the effect of unifying it and turning it into a major political headache in the future. But I'm going to bracket Egypt for a second. We were generally keeping our heads down because the idea that these former captives, worth a lot of money, ransoms for these people were in excess of $40,000 U.S., an enormous sum for Eritrean families to pay, and a sum so lucrative that, of course, it had a very corrupting effect on those near it and those involved with it. And it also enriched a core of people who managed it. You could see one of their compounds in the distance. Here it is, right here. It's a multi-story building. The Israeli border is right beyond this area. At night, you could see a red light that indicated it. We were that close. Now, what you probably can't see is that above that compound, right here, there's a little white dot. I did a little video expansion of it. You see it up here? That is a little balloon with cameras mounted on it that maintain 360-degree surveillance around the area. It's a very sophisticated operation. The people involved in it are also heavily armed. It is a very touchy and dangerous place at this point. Oh, I'm jumping here. Let me just... Well, I can give you a quick... I got out of Sinai. I can talk about this later if people are interested in the specifics. I got a chance to visit 2 Egyptian prisons on the way out where I found 25 former trafficking victims imprisoned because they had tried to make their way out of Sinai without papers, and the Egyptians had taken them and imprisoned them. Part of our mission was to get the biographical information about them and help them get papers as well. But this is the thing, that once you get out of this horrendous situation with the traffickers near the border and you find yourself not safe at all, and in fact at risk of eventual deportation. So I went from here back to Sudan, for the first time in quite a few years, to try to get a close-in sense of the source of much of the trafficking in eastern Sudan. I got permission, which is not easy in Sudan, to go to the border town of Kassala, right across from Eritrea, and the central town in the area where most refugees come across. As you get close to Kassala, within, say, 40, 50 kilometers, around Connell, if you're familiar with it here for the Eritrean population, you start to see the build-up of a community on the left side of the road, which is where they're limited. Rashidas, people from Sudanese and Eritrean Bedouin background, Arabic-speaking people who migrated to the region in the 19th century, who are a very insular group living in both Eritrea and Sudan for many years and moving back and forth as if there were no borders. Traders for a long time who had reached across the Sahel in their heyday. Smugglers today, and the other end of the smuggling operation. They're the ones that were helping Eritreans to get places for a fee and eventually capturing and kidnapping them and selling them up the line. What was remarkable about what I was seeing here was that the settlement of the Rashida, historically a semi-nomadic people, was a new phenomenon. They were establishing permanent residences here, compounds, businesses, and so on. There's actually a sort of surface gold mining business going on here that they're involved in. Also a lot of trade. But as I asked people about this, I learned too that the Sudanese authorities were quite frightened of going into these compounds. So it's a practically autonomous community that now includes most of the Rashida who are in Eritrea as they've come out to settle here. Not really as refugees. This is a case really of simply crossing a border that doesn't matter to them and setting up shop here. As we traveled along the road, though, you could see car after car and Rashidas driving pickup trucks with contraband in the back openly, big plastic jerry cans of fuel, unmarked crates. They would take turns off on a dirt road toward Eritrea. Many of them had no license plates. Sudanese authorities, again, wouldn't touch them. This is a little like the powder keg that I mentioned in eastern and northern Sinai. People left to themselves, increasingly involved in criminal trafficking that the regimes where they reside are frightened to death of and are doing very little to stop. Now, the story gets a little more complicated in that there have been efforts to stop some of the movement of people into the Sinai, and the Sinai itself has gotten to be a much less secure place, even for the traffickers. And the Rashida down the line in this chain have figured out, too, that instead of taking a small fee for kidnapping and sending the Eritreans on, they can make more by holding them and ransoming themselves. And there is a growing business in the capture of Eritreans and some Ethiopians, but mostly Eritreans, in the area of the border around Sudan and across inside Eritrea, with the Rashida taking them into their own community here and ransoming them from there, and then releasing them out to Kassala or Khartoum. So what you've got is a phenomenally lucrative operation that is growing and shifting as piecemeal efforts are made to disrupt it. And it threatens to get even bigger and more difficult to stop, not least because the money involved is enough to buy off officials at the borders and also to pay finder's fees for people who will capture Eritreans deep inside Eritrea and bring them out, and hence to get a whole population that can be ransomed that nobody ever records. They never get registered as refugees. So I think what this highlighted for me is that there is a big problem. It involves many countries in the region, and it needs to be dealt with in an international context and not just a local one if it's to be completed. Here's another shot of the Rashida area. You can start to see that this is not the sign of a temporary residing population. And that's about it for the slides. How do I get the lights up? I'll leave that up there to say that I have been writing about this. I've got a series in a journal called Middle East Report. It's a quarterly magazine that comes out of Washington. The third part in that series on what I saw and heard in Sudan and Egypt will be out by the end of this month. And as soon as my articles come out, I copy them and post them on my website. So you can find them free there. So let me pull this together a little bit. How are we doing here? Oh, boy. Now, as during the liberation struggle, there are hidden networks in Eritrea that are far more important than visible institutions. And in many respects, the Eritrean regime is functioning more as a guerrilla movement headed by a charismatic leader than a modern state. To guard against recurrences of dissent, the PFDJ runs a system of informers that reaches into every village and town, as well as into the diaspora, through a network of supporters who often monitor dissent among Eritreans abroad and report on them to their embassies. The result is a remarkably effective and efficient tyranny in Eritrea, which one hears very little about because there is no reporting on it from the inside. The structure of rule in Eritrea is neither one of a cabal of strong personalities presiding over weak institutions, as is often the case, or weak leaders in the midst of strong institutions. Instead, you have one very strong personality surrounded by weak institutions. The point here is that there is no obvious successor because he hasn't permitted a rival to arise, and that the state itself is quite fragile because the institutions aren't strong in themselves. The branches of government themselves that one sees from the outside tend to be a facade. This is one-man rule, largely exercised through informal networks that shift at the president's discretion. The National Assembly doesn't even meet anymore. The regime has banned or gutted all institutions but one. Basically, there are no parties, no NGOs, no independent organizations, no non-state media, as I said. And it has even undermined the authority of elders and intervened in the leadership of religious bodies. The only standing institution that is really solid is the Eritrean Defense Force, the military. And the country has been thoroughly militarized. That's where much of the power in the country resides today. In the hands of the president, top generals, key individuals in the political leadership of the PFDJ, individuals in the president's office, and the national security. And in fact, they may all be tied together, as was the case in the 1970s and 80s, by a clandestine organization. But I don't have a full handle on that. It sure looks like it, though. But we also know something about such highly repressed societies. They're fundamentally unstable, but the instability isn't expressed in the usual ways because it's simply too dangerous to do it. The crucial point here, though, is that once a political turning point arrives, events there will unfold quickly. Let me just say a few things about events over the last 18 months and then wrap it up. There were a series of events, small in and of themselves, that signal a less stable and permanent situation in Eritrea. There were cross-border attacks from Ethiopia in March of 2012 on camps inside Eritrea alleged to be housing opposition groups from Ethiopia. Eritrea didn't respond, the first time that's happened. Isaiah disappeared from public view for 2 months after that, in April and May, leading to a lot of wild speculation that maybe something was up, and then he showed up again. It's hard to know how to interpret that, but there was something going on there, because it was the first time that has ever happened. Not too long after that, Isaiah began arming all able-bodied adults and setting up new militias by handing out AK-47s to the older adults who were not in the armed forces, and moved to shake up the EDF command. Then in January of this year, on January 21st, there was a brief uprising or protest that took place in which a small group of military officers took basic control of the Ministry of Information. It's up on a high hill that was once an Italian fort known as Forto, and they demanded that, they asked that demands that they had be read over Eritrean TV. They got as far as the reinstatement of the Constitution and the freeing of political prisoners when the TV was shut off. Basically the protest was broken up. But it has been known since then, at home and abroad, as Forto, for the place that it happened. Outside the country, it triggered a wave of protests, and I think you had some here, certainly in Ottawa, as well as Europe and the U.S. Inside, it set off a round of arrests, as in 2001. And in fact, there have been announcements this week that there is a major reorganization going on in Eritrea, of the leadership going all the way down to the lower levels. The meetings that are preparing this are in the same place as those in August of 2001, the town of Ambakala, and it appears very much that a purge is imminent again. Meanwhile, however, the younger generation is getting increasingly impatient with their elders on this and becoming increasingly active. There's a vibrant alternative media that's developed in the diaspora. There are websites that are very active, vigorous debates on the internet, not always polite, but at least they take place. Thousands participate in discussions and civil debates on sites like Paltalk. There have been a kind of eruption of Eritrean NGOs, community centers, and civil society organizations, all of which is outside, and the appearance of new media, print, broadcast, and digital. One of the more interesting and innovative protests took place over the last year when young Eritreans organized a campaign of robocalls to telephone numbers in the Eritrean towns and cities, and then made a whole hundreds of personal calls directly. And what was perhaps most interesting about that was that people answered them and had conversations without fear of being overheard, something new. There's also been a campaign that they call Freedom Fridays, which was focused initially on asking people to stay home to show a kind of passive resistance that has been successful. And this week they announced the launch of a new underground paper in Asmara, the first since the press that we started talking about was shut down, called Echoes of Forto, produced by Eritreans in Asmara and in the diaspora, and timed, of course, to coincide with the 2001 crackdown. So in some ways, we've come full circle. I just want to kind of end with a short list of some measures that could move this situation forward, and that the Canadian government could be pushed toward as well. First, there's an enormous need to promote action to halt the trafficking of Eritreans in Sudan and Egypt. This is important for the victims of this trafficking scheme, and it's also important for the Eritrean population to see that the international community cares what happens to them. There needs to be increased support for the refugees in the camps. This is a young, potentially volatile population in dead-end situations, and they need not only food to get through the day, but some opportunities for education and jobs, or there will be great difficulties. And also, people will continue to move on from where they are. Canada The U.S., Israel, and others needs to be far more accepting of Eritrean asylum seekers. I get calls sometimes to do country condition affidavits for Eritreans threatened with deportation from Canada, sometimes based on the fact that they had a relationship to one of the liberation movements back in the 1970s. And that needs to be confronted and challenged. Eritreans in Canada have been working to challenge the efforts of the regime to collect a 2% tax, which has been used to keep the government afloat for many years. Diaspora Eritreans are required to pay a 2% tax every year if they want access to the country. Passports, access to land, to relatives, and so on.
Excuse me, that's a lie. I'm saying right here, you can't say that to my face.
I'm going to say it right to your face.
You're saying it, but you're saying a lie.
Hold on.
I haven't paid my taxes in 10 years, and I still go in and out of Eritrea. That's a lie. You know that, and you're the one that's propagating that lie too. No, that's not true.
I would ask everybody to stop this, and we will have a chance for anybody, whether you agree with me or not, to make a statement about it. But I'm going to wrap it up.
Whatever you say is true. Whatever you say is true. Everything is true.
Let's wrap it up.
Let me finish and we have a question. We will question you. Let me finish first and then we question you. You know about Eritrea, okay?
Yeah.
But you don't know anything. No.
Excuse me? Hi. Could I please have your phone? Thank you. Hello? Excuse me? Can we please have some silence? Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, so Dan will be finishing his talk, and then we'll have a time period for questions, and then everyone will be able to ask one question per person, so we please ask if we have Dan finish his talk. Thank you so much. We have time for comments and questions at the end. Okay, thank you so much. Please let's just have him finish his talk. Thank you. Thank you.
I think that those who are contesting the truth need to go back and take a look at what has happened in Eritrea over the last decade and explain why there are so many tens of thousands of people who have left. It defies the imagination that there is not a problem there that's driving people out. I would end, and I'm really right at the end, with a couple more calls for action on this, one of which is that the Canadian government, the U.S. government, and European countries need to pressure Ethiopia to accept the 2002 Boundary Commission ruling on the border to remove that issue from the equation. Fear of Ethiopia holds many Eritreans back from action. And I would say that it's crucially important to support Eritrea's alternative media so that there is open discussion of these and other issues within the community and outside it, and not the shutting down of points of view that people don't accept. And I'm going to wrap up with that.